In ancient Rome, under a law known as the Lex Regia, there was a curious and solemn rule. It stated that if a pregnant woman died, she could not be buried until the child was first cut from her womb. This was not an act of frantic, hopeful rescue. It was a law born not of medicine, but of ritual. The Romans were not trying to save a life. They were trying to separate two deaths. A child who died in the womb, still part of its mother, could not have its own burial, its own identity in the eyes of the gods and the community. The law demanded a separation, ensuring that two distinct souls were given their distinct final rights, a quiet, pragmatic, and profoundly spiritual piece of ancient legislation. Before we start our journey into this idea, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. This ancient practice, a post-mortem cesarean performed for the sake of burial, raises a question that has echoed and evolved through the centuries, growing more complex with every medical advancement. When one life ends while another has yet to fully begin, what are our obligations to both? And how have technology, faith, and ethics shaped our answer? Over the course of our time together, we will trace this extraordinary thread from that ancient Roman rite to the gleaming, humming intensive care units of today. We will explore how a procedure once intended to save a soul for the afterlife became a way to save a body for this life, and what this transformation reveals about our deepest beliefs on life, death, and motherhood. The story begins not with a scalpel intended to heal, but one intended to sanctify. It begins with the simple, profound reality of two heartbeats and the moment when one of them falls silent. Consider the quiet paradox contained within a single body. A life has ended, but life itself continues. For a few minutes, or in the modern era, for months, a body can become a threshold, a space that is at once a tomb and a cradle. This idea challenges our neat categories of animate and inanimate, of presence and absence. For our ancestors, this was a matter of spiritual and social housekeeping. The community had a responsibility to acknowledge both individuals. The mother had completed her journey. Her body was a vessel that had finished its voyage. The child, however, was on a journey of its own, even if it was a journey that ended before it began. A separate burial was a separate story, a distinct name whispered to the wind, a recognized place within the grand ledger of the community. There was no technology to sustain the child, no hope of a miracle birth from a deceased mother. There was only the duty to the dead, a duty to see them both clearly as separate beings. This ancient perspective is grounded in a world where the lines were stark. Death was swift, final, and visible. The body grew cold, life departed, and the responsibilities of the living began immediately. They were responsibilities of ritual, of memory, of ensuring the dead found peace in the next world so that the living could find peace in this one. But what happens when technology begins to blur those lines? What happens when the moment of death is no longer a single, observable event, but a prolonged, managed process? This is the central shift in our story. The invention of the ventilator, the concept of brain death, the ability to technologically support a body's biological functions long after consciousness has ceased. These things didn't just change medicine. They changed our relationship with mortality itself. They took the ancient Roman scenario and amplified its complexity 1,000 times over. The question was no longer simply about ensuring a separate burial. Suddenly, it became about sustaining a separate life. The mother's body, once seen as a sacred vessel to be respectfully emptied, could now be transformed into a living incubator, a bridge of flesh and blood sustained by machines and chemistry. This is a transformation of astonishing proportions. It forces us to ask questions the Romans could never have conceived of. If a woman in life created an advance directive stating she wanted no extraordinary measures to prolong her existence, does that wish still hold when her body is the only thing sustaining the potential life of her child? Who gets to decide? The grieving partner? Her parents? The doctors, guided by their oath to preserve life? Or does the state itself have a compelling interest in the life of the unborn child? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They are agonizing realities played out in the quiet, sterile rooms of hospitals around the world. The story of the post-mortem birth is the story of humanity's ever-evolving dance with death. It's a story that reveals our deepest anxieties and our most profound hopes. In one era, the primary concern was the fate of the baby's soul, the fear of it being trapped in limbo, unbaptized. For centuries, priests, not just physicians, would advocate for the procedure, driven by a theological imperative to save the child from eternal damnation. The focus was entirely on the afterlife. The physical survival of the infant was a near impossibility, a one-in-a-million miracle that would be spoken of for generations if it ever occurred. Then, as science and medicine slowly gained ground, the focus shifted. With the dawn of anesthesia, antiseptic surgery, and a deeper understanding of physiology, the impossible began to seem merely improbable. Doctors began to perform the procedure not for the priest, but for the child itself, racing against the clock in the minutes after a mother's sudden death, hoping to deliver a living, breathing baby into the world. These were desperate, heroic acts at the very edge of medical possibility. And now, we live in a third era, an era of prolonged somatic support, where the race is not against minutes, but against weeks and months of gestation. It is an era where a team of specialists can meticulously manage every biological function of a brain-dead woman to bring her pregnancy to term. They become the custodians of that space between worlds, managing hormones, nutrition, and oxygen levels, fighting off infections, and monitoring the silent growth of the fetus. It is a medical marvel, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless drive to nurture life. But it is also a profound ethical and emotional labyrinth. We will walk through this labyrinth together. We will look at the legal gray zones, where laws written for the living are awkwardly applied to the deceased. We will consider the immense emotional burden on families who must grieve a wife or daughter while simultaneously hoping for the birth of a grandchild or a child. They visit a loved one in the ICU, a person who is gone, yet whose body remains warm, whose chest rises and falls with the rhythm of a machine, and whose womb carries the family's future. We will also listen to the silent toll it takes on the nurses and doctors who provide this unique and challenging care, navigating their own moral compasses as they tend to a patient who is, by all clinical definitions, no longer there. The journey from the Lex Regia to the modern ICU is not just a history of a medical procedure. It is a reflection of ourselves. It shows how our tools don't just solve old problems, but create new ones. forcing us to constantly redefine what it means to be alive, what it means to be a parent, and what our ultimate duty is to one another, even across the final threshold of death. The name itself, the Caesarean section, is shrouded in a popular myth. The story we're often told is that Julius Caesar was born this way, giving the procedure its imperial name. It's a compelling image, a future emperor brought into the world through a dramatic, life-saving act of surgery. But the truth is more direct and far less triumphant. The term almost certainly comes from the Latin verb caedere, which simply means to cut. This etymology points us back not to a story of a famous birth, but to the ancient Roman law we just discussed, the Lex Regia, which mandated the cutting of a child from a deceased mother. The name was never about saving a living mother. It was about an action performed on the dead. And as the Roman Empire faded and Christianity rose to become the dominant force in Europe, the reason for this post-mortem cutting underwent a profound transformation. The focus shifted from the pragmatic need for a separate burial to a far more urgent, and in the eyes of the faithful, a far more critical mission: the salvation of the infant's soul. To understand the sheer force of this new imperative, we have to step into the medieval mindset, a world shaped by a deep and abiding concern for the afterlife. Central to Catholic doctrine was the concept of original sin. The belief was that every human being is born with a spiritual stain inherited from the disobedience of Adam and Eve. Baptism, the sacred rite of washing with holy water, was seen as the only way to cleanse this sin, to formally initiate the soul into the Christian community and open the gates of heaven. Without it, even the most innocent soul, that of a newborn baby, could not achieve paradise. So, what happened to a baby who died before this life-saving ritual could be performed? The answer was a concept that brought immense anxiety to countless generations of parents: limbo. Limbo was imagined as a place on the edge of hell, a state of perfect natural happiness, but one of eternal separation from the divine presence of God. The souls there were not punished, but they would never know the ultimate joy of heaven. For a devout family, the thought of their child being denied this celestial communion for all eternity was an unbearable tragedy. And this theological framework turned the death of a pregnant woman into a spiritual emergency. The moment her life ended, a clock started ticking. The primary goal was no longer medical, it was sacramental. The desperate act of cutting into her body was a race to reach the child, while it might still draw a single fleeting breath, enough to be considered alive for the purpose of baptism. Even if the child was born still, some theological interpretations allowed for a conditional baptism, a hope against hope that a flicker of life remained unseen. A midwife, a family member, or anyone present could perform the rite, sprinkling water and reciting the holy words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." This was not medicine as we know it. It was faith enacted with a blade. Early medical and legal texts from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance reflect this priority with stark clarity. Church councils issued decrees making the procedure obligatory. In some regions, a doctor or midwife who failed to perform a post-mortem section could face excommunication. The famous 16th century French surgeon Ambroise Paré, considered one of the fathers of modern surgery, described the procedure in his texts, treating it not as an innovative surgical technique, but as a solemn duty rooted in religious law. These instructions were not about sterile fields or anatomical precision. They were about speed and access. The procedure was often crude, performed with whatever sharp implement was available in the dim light of a candlelit room, surrounded by grieving family members praying for the soul of the child. It was an act born of love and fear in equal measure. The mother's body, in this context, was viewed with a mixture of reverence and pragmatism. Her soul had departed for its judgment. Her body, while still deserving of respect, was now a vessel holding another soul in peril. The act of cutting it open was not seen as a desecration, but as a final, desperate act of maternal care, a way for the community to help her complete her sacred duty to her child. It was a physical intervention to solve a spiritual problem. The focus was so intensely on the afterlife that the possibility of the child actually surviving for any length of time was almost an afterthought. A live birth from a post-mortem section was a vanishingly rare event, a miracle that would be recorded in parish registers and spoken of for decades. It was hoped for, of course, but it was not the primary objective. The objective was to open a doorway, not into the world, but into heaven. The Caesarean sword of this era was an instrument of theology. It was guided by the hand of faith, intended to sever the spiritual chains of original sin. This historical reality is crucial because it sets the stage for everything that follows. For centuries, the most advanced medical minds in Europe approached this procedure with their eyes turned toward the next world, not this one. The life of the mother was already lost, and the life of the child was seen as almost certainly forfeit. The only variable that could be changed, the only thing human hands could intervene in, was the eternal fate of the soul. This powerful, driving belief meant that the procedure was practiced and refined for reasons that had almost nothing to do with clinical survival. It was a ritualized, legally and religiously mandated act that normalized the idea of opening a deceased mother's body to retrieve her child. And in doing so, it inadvertently laid a long, slow-burning fuse. It created a foundation of practice and acceptance so that when medical science finally began to catch up, when the survival of the infant started to shift from an impossible dream to a remote possibility, the idea of performing a cesarean section on a deceased woman was already deeply embedded in the cultural and medical consciousness. The motivation would change, but the act itself had been rehearsed for generations. The engine driving the practice of post-mortem sections for the better part of a millennium was the powerful theology of the soul. In Christian Europe, the fate of the unborn and the newly born was a matter of intense doctrinal debate and profound personal anxiety, all revolving around the concept of original sin. As we've touched upon, this wasn't a minor point of theology. It was the foundational story of humanity's fallen state, a spiritual inheritance passed down from Adam and Eve to every single person born into the world. Baptism was the antidote, the cleansing sacrament that washed this stain away and made the soul eligible for heaven. Without it, the gates remained closed. This created an agonizing problem for miscarried fetuses, stillborn infants, and any baby who died before the holy water could touch their brow. The solution, Limbo, was a theological compromise, a place of natural happiness but eternal separation from God. That satisfied clerical logic, but did little to soothe the hearts of grieving parents. It was this fear of limbo that gave the post-mortem cesarean its sacred urgency. The procedure was a direct, physical intervention aimed at solving a metaphysical crisis. The writings of influential theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas solidified this worldview. They wrote with certainty about the necessity of baptism for salvation, leaving little room for exceptions. This doctrine trickled down from the highest echelons of the church to the local parish priest, who in turn instructed his congregation. Midwives were trained not only in the practical arts of childbirth, but also in the spiritual emergency protocols. They were taught to perform emergency baptisms, sometimes even attempting to baptize a child while it was still partially in the birth canal, using specially designed baptismal syringes if necessary. And if the mother died during labor, the midwife or a surgeon was expected to act swiftly, not just as a medical practitioner, but as a rescuer of souls. The desperation was palpable. The cutting of the mother's body was seen as the lesser of two tragedies when weighed against the eternal separation of a child from its creator. But this was not the only religious perspective, and the contrast is illuminating. In Jewish law, or halakha, the approach to the same tragic scenario was guided by a different set of principles. While Judaism certainly has a concept of the soul, it lacks the specific doctrine of original sin and the sacramental necessity of a ritual like baptism for salvation. The primary concern in halakha is the sanctity of life, pikuach nefesh, which holds that the preservation of a human life overrides almost all other religious laws. Furthermore, great reverence is given to the deceased body, which is to be buried whole and undisturbed as quickly as possible. This created a very different ethical calculation. The idea of cutting into a deceased mother's body was not taken lightly, as it could be seen as a form of desecration. However, the imperative to save a life, if possible, could potentially override this concern. The crucial question in Jewish law became one of viability. Is the fetus alive and capable of surviving outside the womb? In ancient and medieval times, the answer was almost always no. Therefore, the focus remained on honoring the deceased mother and ensuring her swift, proper burial. The fetus was considered a part of her body. However, as medical knowledge advanced, the conversation began to shift. Rabbinic scholars debated the precise moment a fetus is considered a distinct life, or nefesh. Most sources agree that this occurs once the head or the greater part of the body has emerged from the birth canal. Before this, while the fetus is cherished and protected, its life is considered secondary to the mother's. If a mother's life is in danger, an abortion is permitted to save her. But in the case of a mother who has just died, if there was a credible belief that the child was still alive and could be saved by a rapid delivery, the principle of pikuach nefesh for the child would come into play. The act would be permitted, not for the sake of its soul's entry into a specific afterlife, but for the sake of its continued life in this world. So we see two distinct paths emerging from two different theological starting points. The Catholic tradition, driven by the urgency of baptism, mandated the procedure for centuries with a purely spiritual goal. This created a widespread, accepted practice of post-mortem intervention long before it had any real medical benefit. The Jewish tradition, driven by the principles of preserving life and honoring the dead, approached the procedure with more caution, making it contingent on the real, demonstrable possibility of infant survival. One was saving a soul for the next world. The other was saving a person for this one. This distinction is vital because it marks the beginning of a monumental transition in the history of this practice. The slow, gradual pivot from a spiritual imperative to a medical one. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was a creeping change that occurred over centuries as flickers of medical possibility began to illuminate the darkness of what was once considered inevitable. For a long time, the two motivations existed side by side. A doctor in the 17th or 18th century might perform a post-mortem section with a dual hope: to baptize the child, yes, but also, perhaps, with a growing sense of optimism, to see it live. We can imagine the scene. The priest stands ready with his holy water and prayer book, representing the ancient tradition and the concern for the eternal. The surgeon stands with his instruments, representing the emerging science and the concern for the temporal. For the grieving family, this distinction likely mattered very little. They simply wanted to do right by both mother and child in every way they knew how. They were caught between the world of faith and the world of budding science, hoping for a miracle on any terms, spiritual or physical. But the balance was slowly tipping. As anatomical knowledge grew, as surgical techniques became slightly more refined, and as rare, astonishing stories of surviving infants began to circulate, the medical goal started to gain prominence. The idea that the child's life might not be forfeit, that it could be brought into the world to live and breathe and grow, began to take root. The procedure was still a desperate gamble, but the nature of the prize was changing. It was no longer just about securing a place in heaven, but about claiming a place on earth. The scalpel, for so long an instrument of faith, was slowly being reforged into an instrument of medicine. The slow, hesitant dawn of viability began not as a revolution, but as a series of scattered, almost unbelievable whispers. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, the worlds of medicine and surgery were undergoing a painstaking transformation. The old ways, steeped in tradition and superstition, were gradually giving way to a new era of observation, anatomy, and cautious experimentation. For most of this period, the survival of an infant delivered by post-mortem section remained a near impossibility. A fluke of nature celebrated more as a miracle than a medical achievement. Yet, these rare events were meticulously documented, becoming the crucial data points that slowly shifted the focus from saving a soul to saving a life. Consider the immense obstacles. Before the understanding of germ theory, surgery was a horrifically dangerous affair, with infection being an almost certain outcome. Anesthesia was non-existent, a factor that didn't matter for the deceased mother, but spoke to the brutal state of the art. Most critically, the understanding of fetal physiology and the delicate needs of a premature infant was rudimentary at best. A baby born even a few weeks early was at extreme risk, and the infants delivered in these emergency scenarios were often profoundly premature, thrust into the world from a body that was rapidly shutting down. The circulatory system of a deceased mother fails quickly, depriving the fetus of the oxygenated blood it needs to survive. The window of opportunity was terrifyingly brief, measured not in hours, but in minutes. Success depended on a confluence of improbable factors. The mother's death had to be sudden and not the result of a prolonged, wasting illness. Someone with the knowledge and courage to perform the operation had to be present immediately, and the fetus had to be mature enough to have a chance of breathing on its own. Despite these overwhelming odds, the accounts began to accumulate. One of the most famous early cases was recorded in 1500 in Switzerland. A sowgelder named Jacob Neufer, whose wife was suffering through an agonizing and obstructed labor, reportedly received permission from local magistrates to attempt a cesarean section. Miraculously, both mother and child were said to have survived. While the historical accuracy of this specific account is debated by some, its power as a story was immense. It planted a seed of possibility. But this was a living mother. The challenge of a deceased one was far greater. Medical journals of the 18th and 19th centuries began to feature case reports from doctors across Europe who had successfully delivered a living child from a mother who had just died. A 1738 report from a German physician detailed the successful delivery of a baby from a mother who had died of a seizure. A French surgeon in 1779 published an account of saving an infant whose mother had succumbed to a sudden hemorrhage. These reports were written with a tone of awe and astonishment. The physicians would describe in great detail the mother's final moments, the frantic decision to intervene, the speed of the operation, often performed on a bed or a kitchen table with basic instruments, and the magical, unbelievable moment when the retrieved infant let out its first cry. The language they used was often a blend of the scientific and the divine. They would note the time elapsed since the mother's last breath, the condition of the infant, its weight and length, but they would also describe the event as an act of providence, a sign of God's grace. Each successful case became a beacon. It proved that the window of life, however small, was real. It transformed the procedure in the medical imagination from a purely religious rite into a legitimate, if desperate, life-saving measure. The conversation in medical societies and textbooks began to change. Instructions became more clinical. There were debates about the optimal timing. How many minutes after the mother's final respiration was too many? There were discussions about the best technique to open the abdomen and uterus to minimize trauma to the child. The focus was shifting from the sacramental to the physiological. This evolution was also driven by a broader cultural shift, the Enlightenment, which championed reason, science, and the value of individual human life on Earth. The idea of saving a baby so it could live a full life in this world began to gain a moral and philosophical weight that rivaled the older imperative of saving its soul for the next. Doctors began to see themselves not just as servants of faith, but as agents of life. Performing a successful post-mortem section became a mark of supreme skill and courage, a pinnacle of the obstetric art. The celebration that followed one of these miracle births was immense. The child was often seen as a special, almost magical being, a life plucked directly from the jaws of death. They were living symbols of hope in a world where childbirth was still a perilous journey for both mother and infant. These children represented a victory, however small, of human intervention over the finality of fate. They demonstrated that even in the face of the ultimate loss, the death of a mother, something precious could still be salvaged. Yet we must not romanticize this period. For every celebrated success, there were countless unrecorded failures. The vast majority of these attempts resulted in the delivery of a stillborn child, reinforcing the grim odds. And the procedure itself remained a traumatic event for the grieving family, a violent postscript to their loss. But the possibility, however remote, had been proven. The data, collected one miraculous case at a time, was undeniable. Life could persist, however briefly, after death. A child could be saved. This fundamental proof of concept was the necessary precondition for everything that would come next. It established the medical legitimacy of the procedure and fueled the desire to improve the odds. The doctors of this era were working at the absolute limit of their knowledge and technology. They had taken a ritual of faith and through observation and daring had turned it into a race against time. They couldn't slow the clock, but they had shown that the race could, on the rarest of occasions, be won. The next great leap would not be about getting faster, but about finding a way to stop the clock altogether. The groundwork was laid. The moral and medical justification was now in place. The world was waiting for a technology that could hold death in abeyance, a technology that could transform the mother's body from a place of rapid decay into a vessel where life could be nurtured, protected, and brought to term on a schedule dictated not by tragedy, but by biology. The 20th century didn't just change the odds of the post-mortem birth. It fundamentally changed the nature of death itself. The race against the fleeting minutes after a mother's heart stopped was about to be transformed into a prolonged, technologically managed marathon. This shift was not born from obstetrics, but from two seemingly unrelated medical revolutions: the development of effective life support and the new, challenging concept of brain death. Together, these two breakthroughs would create an entirely new reality, turning what was once a desperate last-ditch effort into a sustained, deliberate medical protocol. The mother's body, for the first time in history, could become a living incubator. First came the technology. The iron lung, developed in the 1920s to combat the polio epidemic, was a mechanical respirator that could breathe for a person whose own respiratory muscles were paralyzed. It was a clumsy, room-sized machine, but it established a monumental principle. A fundamental biological process, breathing, could be outsourced to a machine. Over the next few decades, this technology was refined. The development of the positive pressure ventilator, which pushes air into the lungs through a tube, allowed this life-sustaining support to move from specialized polio wards into the newly emerging intensive care units, or ICUs. Alongside ventilators came a cascade of other innovations: intravenous drips for nutrition and hydration, cardiac monitors, defibrillators, and a sophisticated pharmacy of drugs that could manage blood pressure, fight infection, and regulate bodily functions. For the first time, doctors could sustain a person's circulation and respiration long after their own body had lost the ability to do so. This new power created a profound and troubling dilemma. It used to be simple. When the heart stopped beating and a person stopped breathing, they were dead. But now, machines could keep the heart beating and the lungs inflating indefinitely. This led to a new class of patients, individuals in deep, irreversible comas whose bodies were biologically functioning, but whose consciousness, personality, and capacity for thought were gone forever. This raised a terrifying question. Are these people alive or dead? The medical, legal, and ethical world struggled for an answer. The answer came in the form of a new definition of death. In 1968, a landmark report from a committee at Harvard Medical School proposed the concept of brain death, defining it as the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. According to this new standard, a person could be declared legally dead, even if their heart was still beating, sustained by a ventilator. This was a seismic shift in human understanding. Death was no longer just the loss of a pulse. It was the loss of the integrated, functioning self, the seat of consciousness. And it was at the precise intersection of these two developments, the ventilator and the definition of brain death, that a new possibility was born. A pregnant woman could suffer a catastrophic brain injury, perhaps from a car accident, a ruptured aneurysm, or a fall. She could be declared legally and clinically brain dead. Her life as a person was over. But if she was placed on a ventilator before her heart stopped, her body could be kept alive. Her lungs would breathe, her heart would pump, her organs would continue to function, all under the management of the ICU team. And inside her, the fetus, if it survived the initial trauma, could continue to grow, nourished by the blood and nutrients circulating through her technologically sustained body. This was the birth of what is now known as maternal somatic support. The term itself is clinical, precise, and emotionally detached, but the reality it describes is one of the most profound and surreal in all of medicine. The focus was no longer on a frantic, last-minute delivery. The goal now was to delay delivery, to maintain the mother's deceased body as a stable biological vessel for as long as possible, giving the fetus the precious weeks or months it needed to mature to the point of viability and beyond. The race against minutes had become a race against gestation. The mother's body, once seen as a rapidly failing system from which a child had to be rescued, was now viewed as an essential, life-sustaining environment that had to be meticulously preserved. It was, in the starkest terms, a biological machine that could be managed and maintained to complete its final task. The first well-documented cases of prolonged somatic support began to appear in medical literature in the early 1980s. Each one was a journey into uncharted territory. Doctors had to learn, through trial and error, how to manage the complex physiology of a brain-dead patient, a body that has lost its central regulator. They had to figure out how to provide nutrition, manage the wild hormonal fluctuations that occur when the brain is no longer in control, prevent infections, and control body temperature. They essentially had to become the external brainstem for the deceased patient, manually overseeing the hundreds of autonomic functions that a living body performs without a thought. This was not about healing a patient. The patient, the woman herself, was gone. This was a new and entirely different kind of medicine, the management of an ecosystem. This technological leap created a scenario that would have been utterly unimaginable to our ancestors. A family could now stand at the bedside of a loved one who was, by law and by every measure of personhood, deceased. And yet, they could place their hands on her abdomen and feel the kick of a growing child. they would be simultaneously mourning a death and anticipating a birth, all centered around the same silent body. This paradox lies at the heart of the modern story of the post-mortem birth. Technology had solved the ancient problem of time, but in its place, it had created a host of new ethical, emotional, and philosophical questions that were far more complex. The body had been successfully transformed into an incubator, a triumph of medical science. But what did this mean for the dignity of the deceased? What were the psychological costs for the family and the caregivers? And who had the right to decide to embark on such an extraordinary and challenging journey? The Caesarean sword was no longer a tool for a swift rescue, spiritual or physical. The entire ICU had become the instrument, a vast, complex life support system designed to hold a life in stasis, to create a bridge of time, technology, and flesh at the very edge of existence. Embarking on a course of prolonged somatic support is like becoming the conductor of a complex biological orchestra after the original conductor has permanently left the podium. The music, the intricate interplay of systems that constitutes life, must continue. But every note, every tempo change, every crescendo and decrescendo must now be cued manually by an external force. This is the reality for the multidisciplinary team of specialists who undertake the profound responsibility of maintaining a brain-dead woman's body to bring her pregnancy to term. It is a testament to the extraordinary capabilities of modern medicine, a process that is as meticulous and scientifically grounded as it is ethically and emotionally fraught. Let's walk through what this care respectfully entails. The first and most fundamental challenge is maintaining stability. A body without a functioning brainstem is an inherently unstable system. The brainstem is the master regulator, the quiet, tireless overseer of all our vital autonomic functions: breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, temperature. Once it ceases to function, all of these systems begin to fail in a cascading effect. So, the first order of business for the intensive care or ICU team is to seize control. A ventilator takes over the work of the lungs, not just pushing in air, but carefully managing the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. A host of powerful medications, delivered through intravenous lines, are used to manage blood pressure, which can swing wildly without the brain's stabilizing signals. This is a constant balancing act, requiring minute-to-minute adjustments by a critical care nurse. The goal is to create a state of hemodynamic stability, ensuring a steady flow of oxygenated blood reaches the placenta and, through it, the growing fetus. The next critical system to manage is the endocrine system. The brain, particularly the pituitary gland and hypothalamus, is the command center for the body's hormones. Without it, the production of essential hormones collapses. This is especially critical in pregnancy, which is itself a state of profound hormonal change. The medical team must artificially replicate this complex hormonal symphony. They administer thyroid hormones to manage metabolism, steroids to help maintain blood pressure, and, crucially, to help the fetus's lungs mature more quickly. They may also need to provide vasopressin to prevent a condition called diabetes insipidus, where the body loses massive amounts of water, leading to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. In essence, the endocrinologists on the team are providing an external hormonal guidance system, mimicking the signals that the mother's brain would normally be sending. Nutrition is another cornerstone of the protocol. The fetus is growing rapidly and requires a constant supply of calories, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. Since the patient cannot eat, this is provided through total parenteral nutrition, TPN, a specialized liquid formula delivered directly into a large vein or through a feeding tube inserted into the stomach. The nutritional plan is carefully calculated and constantly adjusted by a dietitian based on the gestational age of the fetus and the metabolic needs of the mother's body. Every day is a careful calculation to provide just enough to support the pregnancy without overloading the system. Simultaneously, the team must be relentlessly vigilant against infection. A body in the ICU with multiple intravenous lines, a breathing tube, and a urinary catheter is highly susceptible to opportunistic bacteria. Furthermore, the state of brain death itself can suppress the immune system. A serious infection could be catastrophic for both the mother's body and the fetus. Prophylactic antibiotics may be used, and the patient is monitored constantly for any signs of fever or inflammation. Meticulous hygiene and sterile procedures are paramount. All of this is happening while the obstetric and neonatology teams monitor the most important passenger in this vessel, the baby. Regular ultrasounds are performed to check on fetal growth, movement, amniotic fluid levels, and the health of the placenta. The baby's heart rate is monitored closely for any signs of distress. These teams are looking for specific benchmarks, key milestones in fetal development. The primary goal is to reach a gestational age where the baby has a high probability of survival with a good long-term outcome. This is often a moving target, but a common initial goal is 28 weeks, and an ideal goal is 32 weeks or beyond. Every single day that the pregnancy can be safely maintained in the womb is a victory, giving the baby's lungs, brain, and other organs more time to mature. This is the central drama of prolonged somatic support, a day-by-day, week-by-week journey toward viability and health. This entire process is overseen and coordinated by a vast team. It's not just one doctor. There's the intensivist, who manages the critical care in the ICU. There's the obstetrician, specializing in high-risk pregnancies, who manages the health of the uterus and fetus. There's the neonatologist, the specialist in newborn care, who advises on fetal development and will be there to care for the baby after birth. There are the endocrinologists, dietitians, respiratory therapists, and, of course, the highly skilled critical care nurses who are at the bedside 24/7, acting as the eyes, ears, and hands of the entire team. And woven through all of this is the crucial role of the hospital's ethics committee and palliative care specialists. They are there to support the grieving family, to help them understand the complex medical situation, and to ensure that the decisions being made are in alignment with the values and, if known, the wishes of the woman who is at the center of it all. They help the family navigate the impossible emotional landscape of it all. This is not a passive process. It is an active, demanding, and incredibly resource-intensive form of medical care. It requires a level of coordination and expertise that is only available at major medical centers. It is a profound demonstration of what science can achieve, holding a body in a state of suspended animation, a biological bridge between a life that has ended and a life that is waiting to begin. Every beep of the monitor, every adjustment of a drip, every ultrasound image is a part of this extraordinary effort to shepherd a new life into the world against the most challenging of circumstances. The decision to begin maternal somatic support initiates a solemn and precarious race, not against the clock of sudden death, but against the biological calendar of gestation. The entire endeavor hinges on one critical concept: fetal viability. This term refers to the point at which a fetus is developed enough to have a reasonable chance of survival outside the womb, albeit with significant medical assistance. While it's not a single magical moment, the threshold is generally considered to be around 23 to 24 weeks of gestation. Before this point, the lungs are simply too undeveloped to function, even with the help of a ventilator. A baby born before 23 weeks has an almost 0% chance of survival. Therefore, if a pregnant woman is declared brain dead before this crucial window, the heartbreaking decision is often made not to attempt prolonged support, as the goal is medically unattainable. But if the pregnancy is at or beyond this threshold, the race begins. The goal is to gain as much time as possible. Every single day gained in the womb is a monumental victory for the developing child. Each day dramatically increases the odds of survival and, just as importantly, reduces the risk of the severe long-term disabilities associated with extreme prematurity, such as cerebral palsy, blindness, and developmental delays. The neonatology team often speaks in terms of daily percentage points. At 23 weeks, the chance of survival is perhaps 20 to 30%. By 28 weeks, that number jumps to over 90%. The medical team, alongside the family, sets a series of goals. First, to get to 24 weeks, then 26, then 28. Each milestone is a moment of cautious, quiet relief in the hushed environment of the ICU. It is a slow, steady marathon measured in the silent growth of a child. However, the environment in which this race is run is anything but stable. A deceased body, even one perfectly managed by technology, is a challenging place to nurture a pregnancy. It is a physiological house of cards, and the medical team must constantly guard against the forces that threaten to make it collapse. One of the greatest threats is circulatory instability. As we've discussed, a body without a brainstem struggles to maintain blood pressure. Episodes of hypotension, dangerously low blood pressure, are common. Every time the mother's blood pressure drops, the blood flow to the placenta is reduced, potentially starving the fetus of oxygen and nutrients. This can lead to fetal distress, requiring emergency intervention, or, in the worst case, fetal death. The ICU team fights this with a constant infusion of vasopressor drugs, but it remains a persistent, minute-by-minute battle. Another immense challenge is hormonal collapse. Pregnancy is orchestrated by a complex and dynamic interplay of hormones produced by the mother, the placenta, and the fetus itself. When the mother's brain and its master glands are no longer functioning, this symphony falls silent. The medical team can replace some of the key hormones, like thyroid hormone and corticosteroids, but they cannot perfectly replicate the intricate, shifting hormonal milieu of a healthy pregnancy. This hormonal instability can threaten the integrity of the pregnancy itself, potentially leading to preterm labor, a condition the team works tirelessly to prevent with medications that relax the uterus. They are essentially trying to keep the body from rejecting the pregnancy in the absence of the natural signals that would sustain it. Infection, as we've mentioned, is the ever-present specter haunting every ICU. A brain-dead body is a compromised host, and the risk of developing pneumonia from the ventilator or a bloodstream infection from an IV line is high. A severe infection can trigger a systemic inflammatory response, known as sepsis, which can be catastrophic. The infection can cross the placental barrier, harming the fetus directly, or the resulting instability in the mother's body can force a premature delivery long before the baby is ready. The body itself also begins to change. Without the signals from the brain, muscles begin to atrophy. The patient is at high risk for blood clots forming in the deep veins of the legs, which could travel to the lungs. The skin, under constant pressure, can begin to break down. The nurses provide meticulous care, turning the patient regularly, performing passive range of motion exercises on her limbs, and providing scrupulous skin care, all to maintain the body as a healthy vessel for as long as possible. So, what are the outcomes of this extraordinary race? Success rates have improved significantly since the first attempts in the 1980s. A 2010 review of documented cases found that when somatic support was initiated after 14 weeks of gestation, it resulted in a live birth in about 85% of cases. The length of time that support can be maintained is astonishing. The record is over 100 days, more than 3 months, allowing a fetus to go from the edge of viability to near full term. These successes are medical triumphs of the highest order. But the story doesn't end at birth. The children born through this process, often called miracle babies by the media, face the challenges of any infant born prematurely. They often require a long stay in the neonatal intensive care unit, or NICU, where they may need help with breathing, feeding, and regulating their body temperature. The long-term health outcomes are generally positive and seem to be comparable to other infants born at a similar gestational age. There does not appear to be any unique negative outcome specifically related to gestating in a brain-dead mother. They go on to be healthy children, raised by a grieving father or by grandparents and other relatives. They are a living legacy, a tangible connection to the woman they will never know. Each successful case is a testament to the resilience of the human fetus and the incredible dedication of the medical teams who navigate this complex and demanding course of care. They are running a race where the finish line is not a moment of victory in the traditional sense, but the safe delivery of a new life from a world of profound loss. It is a race run in the quiet, steady rhythm of beeping monitors, a race against the fundamental instability of a body untethered from its neurological anchor, all for the chance to hand a child a future that was almost erased before it could begin. Beneath the gleaming technology and the meticulous medical protocols lies a landscape of profound and unsettling ethical questions. Prolonged maternal somatic support pushes us to the very edge of our understanding of rights, personhood, and the meaning of bodily autonomy. Once a person is declared brain dead, what obligations do we have to their physical form? And how do we balance those obligations against the potential for a new life? This is the ultimate ethical question, a tangled knot of conflicting interests and deeply held beliefs, with the silent, deceased mother at its very center. The first, and perhaps most fundamental principle at stake, is bodily autonomy. In life, a competent adult has the absolute right to accept or refuse any medical treatment, even if that refusal leads to their death. This is the bedrock of modern medical ethics. We honor this principle through tools like live-in wills and advance directives, where a person can state their wishes for end-of-life care in advance. But does this autonomy extend beyond the moment of death? If a woman has a living will that explicitly states she wants no extraordinary measures or artificial life support, must that wish be honored even if it means the termination of her pregnancy? Or does the presence of a viable fetus create a new and overriding interest that she could not have fully anticipated? There is no easy answer, and legal and ethical scholars are deeply divided. Some argue for a position of absolute adherence to the deceased's prior wishes. They contend that to use a woman's body as an incubator against her explicitly stated desires is a profound violation, a reduction of her personhood to a mere biological function. It treats her body as a means to an end, an object for the use of others, no matter how noble that end may be. From this perspective, her right to be free from unwanted bodily intrusion does not simply vanish with her consciousness. Her body is still her body, the physical legacy of her life, and her directives regarding its treatment must be respected as the final expression of her will. It is the ultimate act of honoring her as a person, not just a vessel. On the other side of the debate, others argue that the situation is fundamentally changed by the presence of the fetus. They suggest that a general directive to refuse life support is made with one's own death in mind, not a scenario where that same support could lead to the birth of one's child. They might argue that we can reasonably infer that the woman, as an expectant mother, would have wanted to save her child if she could. This position often invokes the state's interest in protecting potential life. This is the same legal and ethical principle that underpins many laws restricting abortion. Proponents of this view might argue that once a fetus reaches viability, it has its own set of interests, if not full legal rights, that deserve protection. In this tragic scenario, the mother's interests in bodily autonomy are tragically moot. She is, after all, deceased, while the fetus's interest in life is immediate and absolute. Therefore, the argument goes, the balance of interests shifts decisively in favor of sustaining the pregnancy. This conflict brings us to the very heart of the abortion debate, but in a context that is infinitely more complex and rare. We are forced to confront the question of personhood head-on. When does a fetus become a person with rights that can be weighed against the rights of the mother? And how do we weigh the rights of a potential person against the posthumous rights and dignity of a person who has already lived and died? If we decide to sustain the pregnancy, who is the patient? Is it the fetus, with the mother's body being the complex medical device required for its care? Or is the mother's body still considered a patient in some residual sense, deserving of dignity and respect in its own right? The very language we use, maternal somatic support, reveals our struggle. We are treating the soma, the body, but the mater, the mother, as a person, is gone. Into this already complex equation, we must add the desires of the grieving family. What does the father of the child want? His voice carries immense emotional and often legal weight. For him, the child may be the last living piece of the woman he loved, his only hope in a future shattered by loss. He may advocate passionately for doing everything possible to save the baby. But what if the deceased woman's parents, the baby's grandparents, disagree? What if they believe that continuing to ventilate their daughter's body is a violation of her dignity, a horrific and unnatural prolongation of their grief? Whose wishes should take precedence? The law is often unclear, leaving families to navigate an agonizing conflict at the worst possible moment of their lives. These decisions are not made in a sterile debating hall. They are made in the hushed, tense atmosphere of a hospital family conference room, heavy with grief and shock. There are no universal answers to these questions. They are decided on a case-by-case basis, shaped by the specific facts, the known wishes of the mother, the family's consensus or lack thereof, the guidance of the hospital's ethics committee, and the specific laws of the state or country where this tragedy unfolds. The ultimate ethical question is not one we can solve with a simple formula. It is a profound reflection of our deepest societal values. It forces us to ask what we owe to the dead, what we owe to the not yet born, and how we navigate the space between when technology gives us the power to hold a life in limbo. It is a conversation about the limits of medicine, the endurance of love, and the enduring mystery of where one life ends and another begins. While ethicists debate principles and doctors manage physiology, the family at the center of this medical drama is living in a state of profound and surreal limbo. They are suspended between the two most powerful events in human experience, a birth and a death. They inhabit a psychological space that has no name, navigating a landscape of grief and hope that are so deeply intertwined they become impossible to separate. For the family, this is not a case study or an ethical dilemma. It is an agonizing, day-by-day reality that reshapes their understanding of love, loss, and life itself. Imagine the experience of the grieving partner, the expectant father. One moment, he was building a future with the woman he loved, planning for the arrival of their child. The next, he is in a hospital, being told that his partner is brain dead. The person he knew, the mind he loved, the consciousness he shared his life with, is gone forever. He must begin the process of grieving this unimaginable loss. Yet, he cannot fully grieve. He cannot plan a funeral, write a eulogy, or allow himself the finality of closure, because his partner's body is still warm. Her chest rises and falls with the rhythm of the ventilator, and inside her, their child, the future they planned together, is still alive and growing. His daily life becomes a paradox. He might spend his mornings looking at ultrasound photos, marveling at the image of his developing child, and his afternoons meeting with funeral directors. He is forced to hold on to hope and despair in the same hand at the same time. He visits the ICU, a place of hushed efficiency and beeping monitors. He looks at his partner, and he sees both everything he has lost and everything he stands to gain. Is this his wife, or is it a sacred vessel for his child? Can it be both? He might talk to her, hold her hand, play music for the baby, participating in the familiar rituals of pregnancy. But he is speaking to a memory, holding a hand that cannot squeeze back. This experience creates a profound cognitive dissonance, a deep emotional confusion that few people are ever equipped to handle. There is no social script for this, no greeting cards, no established rituals of support. Friends and family don't know what to say. "I'm sorry for your loss" feels incomplete. "Congratulations on the baby" feels premature and insensitive. The emotional burden of visiting a deceased family member in an ICU is immense. A living patient in a coma offers a sliver of hope for recovery. But in the case of brain death, that hope is gone. The signs of life, the heartbeat on the monitor, the warmth of the skin, the mechanically induced breath, are purely technological artifacts. For the family, this can feel like a cruel illusion. They are in the presence of a body that is biologically alive, but biographically dead. They are witnesses to a form of existence that challenges their most basic definitions of life. For the parents of the deceased woman, the experience is just as wrenching. They are grieving the loss of their daughter, yet they are also watching her body perform its final, miraculous act of motherhood. They must grapple with the image of their child, who they raised and loved, being sustained by machines, her dignity in the hands of a medical team. They may feel a fierce protectiveness over her body, alongside a desperate hope for the survival of their grandchild. Let's consider an anonymized story, a composite of real cases, to understand the human dimension. A young couple, Sarah and Tom, are in a car accident. Tom has minor injuries, but Sarah, who is 25 weeks pregnant, suffers a catastrophic head injury and is declared brain dead. The doctors present Tom and Sarah's parents with the option of somatic support. Tom, utterly shattered, immediately agrees. This baby is the last piece of Sarah he has left. Sarah's mother, however, is horrified. She remembers Sarah saying once, after seeing a movie, "If I'm ever on machines like that, just let me go." She feels that prolonging this state is a violation of her daughter's spirit. A tense, grief-stricken debate ensues in the hospital's family room. The ethicist is called in to mediate. They discuss Sarah's values, her love for this unborn child, the meaning of her casual statement. Eventually, Sarah's mother, seeing the desperate hope in Tom's eyes, tearfully agrees to proceed for the sake of her grandchild. For the next 8 weeks, Tom and Sarah's parents live at the hospital. They decorate the ICU room with photos of Sarah. They read children's books to the silent abdomen. The nurses become their confidants, their support system. They celebrate every milestone, 26 weeks, 27, 28. But there are terrifying moments. An infection scare that requires powerful antibiotics. A sudden drop in blood pressure that sends alarms screaming through the night. Each day is a roller coaster of anxiety and hope. Finally, at 33 weeks, the baby, a healthy girl, is delivered by C-section. She is named Hope. In one wing of the hospital, a new family is born in the NICU. In another, the ventilator is finally switched off, and Sarah's body is allowed its final rest. Tom is now a single father to a premature baby, grieving his wife, and navigating a future he never imagined. Sarah's parents are grandparents, but they have just buried their child. Their joy is forever tinged with the deepest sorrow. This is the lasting impact. The birth of the child does not erase the trauma. It is woven into the very fabric of the family's story. The child will grow up with a unique and complex origin story, a story of a mother whose love literally transcended death to give them life. For the family, the ICU is not just a place of medical treatment. It is a sacred space, a crucible where the boundaries between life and death dissolved, and where they learn the absolute limits of both grief and love. they are forever changed, living in a world that is both emptier and fuller than it was before. Just as the ventilator and the concept of brain death forced a reckoning in medicine and law, they also presented a profound challenge to faith. The sterile, technological environment of the modern ICU has become a new and unexpected arena for theological debate, a place where ancient beliefs about life, death, and the soul are tested against the stark realities of what science can now achieve. When a family is faced with the decision to begin or continue maternal somatic support, their religious and spiritual beliefs often become the primary lens through which they view their options, providing comfort, guidance, and sometimes intense conflict. Major world religions have had to grapple with the very definition of brain death. For some, it presents no major theological conflict. Many mainline Protestant denominations, as well as Reform and Conservative Judaism, have largely accepted the neurological standard of death. They reason that the soul, or the essence of personhood, is inextricably linked to the functioning, integrated brain. Once the brain has irreversibly ceased to function, the person is considered to have departed, and the body, though sustained by machines, is merely a collection of biological tissues. In these traditions, the decision to use the body to sustain a pregnancy would be considered an extraordinary means of care. The choice to proceed would likely be viewed as a compassionate act of stewardship, an attempt to save a potential life, and would be left to the conscience of the family, guided by the principle of doing the most good and preserving life where possible. However, other faith traditions hold a more complex view. The Catholic Church, for instance, has a deeply nuanced position. While Pope John Paul II acknowledged in a 2000 address that the neurological standard of death can be a valid indicator, the Church has never made a definitive, dogmatic statement on the matter. It maintains that death is the separation of the soul from the body, an event that medical science can only approximate, not pinpoint. This leaves room for a more cautious approach. A Catholic family might believe that as long as the body is warm and the heart is beating, there is a possibility that the soul has not yet departed, and that to withdraw support would be a grave sin. When a pregnancy is involved, this caution is magnified by the Church's absolute prohibition of abortion and its profound reverence for unborn life. In this context, the use of maternal somatic support would likely be seen not just as permissible, but as a moral obligation, a heroic act to protect the sanctity of life. Similarly, within Orthodox Judaism, there is significant debate. While many accept brain death, a substantial minority of rabbinic authorities adhere to the traditional definition of death as the cessation of both heartbeat and respiration. For a family following this interpretation, a brain-dead patient on a ventilator is still considered a living person, a gozes, a person in the process of dying. To turn off the ventilator would be considered an act of hastening death, which is forbidden. Therefore, they would be morally compelled to continue somatic support, both for the mother, whom they consider to be alive, and for the unborn child. In these cases, a conflict can arise if the hospital's legal and medical definition of death, brain death, clashes with the family's religious definition of life. This is where the role of the hospital chaplain and the religious ethics committee becomes absolutely vital. They act as translators and mediators, bridging the worlds of clinical medicine and spiritual belief. A chaplain doesn't just offer prayer. They help the medical team understand the family's values and help the family understand the complex medical realities in a way that resonates with their faith. They can help a family articulate their fears and hopes, not in medical terms, but in the language of their tradition. They might ask questions like, "What does your faith teach about suffering?" Or, "Where do you see God in this situation?" They create a space where the family's spiritual needs are seen as a valid and essential part of the decision-making process. There are instances where religious belief and medical capability come into direct conflict. Consider the beliefs of some indigenous cultures or certain Eastern religions where the integrity of the body after death is of paramount spiritual importance, believed to be necessary for a peaceful transition to the afterlife or for reincarnation. For a family holding these beliefs, the idea of maintaining the body on machines for months, subjecting it to the constant invasive procedures of an ICU, might be seen as a horrific violation, a tethering of the spirit to the earth that could cause immense spiritual harm to their loved one. They might choose to refuse somatic support, even at the cost of the pregnancy, believing that their primary duty is to ensure the peaceful passage of the deceased. This can be an agonizing choice, pitting one sacred duty, honoring the dead, against another, protecting the unborn. Faith in the modern ICU, therefore, is not a simple matter of comfort or ritual. It is an active and often decisive force in the ethical calculus. It shapes the family's perception of the situation, defines their obligations, and provides the framework for the most difficult decision they will ever have to make. It reminds us that even in the most technologically advanced corners of our world, when we are confronted with the ultimate questions of life and death, we are still guided by beliefs that are ancient, profound, and deeply human. The beeping of the heart monitor becomes a counterpoint to the quiet recitation of a prayer, a fusion of science and spirit in a space where both are desperately needed. As medicine pushes into the uncharted territory of maternal somatic support, the legal system has often been left struggling to catch up. There is no neat, universally accepted body of law governing this specific, rare scenario. Instead, decisions are often made in a legal gray zone, cobbled together from existing laws on advanced directives, healthcare proxies, abortion rights, and the rights of the deceased. Laws that were never designed to address the surreal reality of a brain-dead woman gestating a child. This lack of clear legislation creates inconsistency and uncertainty, often placing immense pressure on families, doctors, and hospitals to navigate these treacherous waters with only a patchwork of legal precedents and ethical guidelines to steer them. The primary legal conflict often revolves around the patient's previously expressed wishes. Most jurisdictions have laws that give legal force to advance directives, such as living wills and durable powers of attorney for healthcare. These documents are intended to protect a patient's autonomy, ensuring their own values guide their medical treatment even when they can no longer speak for themselves. The legal question is, how do these directives apply after the patient has been declared legally dead? In many cases, a person might sign a document stating they refuse life-sustaining treatment if they are in a terminal condition or a persistent vegetative state. But brain death is legally distinct. Once a patient is declared brain dead, they are legally deceased, and the machines are no longer considered to be sustaining their life. Instead, they are sustaining biological functions in a corpse. This distinction is critical. Does a directive to refuse life support for oneself automatically translate to a refusal to have one's body used to support a fetus? The law is often silent on this point. This ambiguity is complicated further by so-called pregnancy exclusion clauses that exist in the advance directive laws of many states. These clauses automatically invalidate a woman's directive to refuse life support if she is pregnant, regardless of the stage of pregnancy or the prognosis for the fetus. These laws were written with a living but incapacitated pregnant woman in mind, not a deceased one. Their application to a brain-dead patient is legally and ethically controversial. Critics argue that applying these clauses to the deceased is a profound violation of bodily autonomy, essentially commandeering a woman's body for the state's interest in potential life. Proponents argue they are a necessary safeguard to protect the unborn. This legal tangle means that the same situation could have drastically different outcomes depending on the specific wording of the law in that state. Landmark court cases have periodically forced the legal system to confront these issues, often with deeply divisive and painful results. One of the most well-known cases occurred in Texas in 2013, involving a woman named Marlise Munoz. She was 14 weeks pregnant when she suffered a pulmonary embolism and was subsequently declared brain dead. Her husband, who knew his wife's end-of-life wishes were to not be kept on machines, asked for the ventilator to be withdrawn. The hospital refused, citing a Texas law that prohibited withdrawing life-sustaining treatment from a pregnant patient. The case ignited a national firestorm. For nearly 2 months, Munoz's body was maintained against her family's wishes. Her husband described her body as deteriorating, her scent changing, saying, "It's not her." Eventually, a judge ruled in the family's favor, but on a technicality, the fetus had been found to be non-viable, likely due to the period of oxygen deprivation during the mother's collapse. The judge's ruling allowed the hospital to remove the ventilator, but it left the central legal question of the pregnancy exclusion law's applicability to a deceased patient unresolved. The Munoz case highlighted the immense emotional toll and the legal chaos that can result from the absence of clear statutes. It showed how a family's private grief could be transformed into a public legal and political battleground. In contrast, other cases have been handled more quietly through consensus between the family and the hospital, guided by an ethics committee. When a woman has not left a clear directive and the family is united in their desire to save the child, the legal path is much smoother. The hospital can proceed with the family's consent, acting on the generally accepted legal principle that the next of kin has the authority to make decisions about the decedent's body, including organ donation, a framework that is sometimes analogized to this situation. However, this analogy is imperfect. Organ donation is a relatively brief process aimed at benefiting multiple recipients. Maternal somatic support is a prolonged, intensive process aimed at benefiting a single potential life, a life that is biologically and legally intertwined with the deceased in a unique way. The legal status of the fetus itself adds another layer of complexity. In the United States, following the landmark Roe v. Wade decision and its subsequent modifications, a fetus is not considered a legal person with constitutional rights. However, states do have a recognized interest in protecting potential life, and this interest grows stronger as the fetus approaches viability. It is this state interest that is often invoked to justify overriding a pregnant woman's wishes. This creates a direct legal conflict. A woman's constitutionally protected right to bodily autonomy, which may extend posthumously, versus the state's interest in the fetus. How these competing interests are balanced is often a reflection of the political and ideological landscape of a particular region, leading to a fractured and inconsistent legal framework across the country and around the world. Ultimately, the legal gray zone surrounding maternal somatic support is a reflection of a deeper societal uncertainty. Our laws are built on clear categories: living or dead, person or property, patient or corpse. This scenario dissolves those categories. It forces us to confront a new state of being that our existing legal language is ill-equipped to describe, let alone regulate. Until legislatures create clear, compassionate, and constitutionally sound laws to address this specific issue, the decisions will continue to be made in the quiet and sometimes agonizing spaces between a family's love, a doctor's oath, and a judge's interpretation of laws written for a world that no longer exists. Beyond the profound ethical and legal thickets lies a starkly pragmatic question that is often uncomfortable to discuss, but impossible to ignore: the cost. Sustaining a brain-dead patient in an intensive care unit for weeks, let alone months, is an extraordinary undertaking, not just medically, but financially. The daily cost of an ICU bed, with its associated technology, staffing, and medications, can run into many thousands of dollars. When you multiply that by the 60, 80, or even 100 days that may be required to bring a fetus to a safe gestational age, the total cost can easily soar into the hundreds of thousands, sometimes exceeding $1 million. This immense financial reality introduces another layer of ethical debate, one that revolves around resource allocation, fairness, and the question of who ultimately bears the cost of a miracle. Let's break down where these costs come from. The ICU bed itself is prime real estate in any hospital. Then there is the constant use of sophisticated equipment, the ventilator, the cardiac and hemodynamic monitors, the intravenous pumps. There is the cost of the vast array of medications, vasopressors to maintain blood pressure, hormones to regulate the body, powerful antibiotics to stave off infection, and the highly specialized liquid nutrition. Add to this the frequent laboratory tests needed to monitor every aspect of the patient's physiology, and the regular imaging studies like ultrasounds to check on the fetus. Perhaps the largest component of the cost is the human expertise. A team of highly specialized physicians, intensivists, obstetricians, neonatologists, endocrinologists are all consulting on the case. And, most critically, there is the 24/7, one-on-one care provided by highly skilled critical care nurses who are the frontline managers of this complex biological system. When all these elements are tallied, the bill accumulates with breathtaking speed. So, who pays for this? The answer is as complex as the care itself. In many cases, the patient's private health insurance is the primary payer. However, insurance policies were written to cover treatment for living patients with the goal of recovery. An insurance company might initially deny a claim for the care of a deceased person, arguing that it is not medically necessary for the insured individual. This can lead to a lengthy and stressful appeals process for the grieving family, who may have to argue that the care is, in fact, medically necessary for the fetus, who is often covered under the mother's policy for a period after birth. In some cases, hospitals have absorbed the cost or engaged in long negotiations with insurers. In countries with nationalized healthcare systems, the cost is borne by the public, which raises a different set of questions about public stewardship and the allocation of collective resources. This financial reality inevitably leads to a difficult ethical conversation about resource allocation. An ICU bed is a finite and precious resource. On any given day, a hospital may have a limited number of ICU beds available and a long list of critically ill living patients who need them. A heart attack victim, a car accident survivor, a patient with severe pneumonia. The decision to dedicate one of these beds, along with the intensive nursing and physician attention it requires, to a deceased patient for a period of months, is a choice that has consequences. It means that bed is not available for another patient who has a chance of recovery and returning to their life and family. This is the cold, hard calculus of hospital administration and public health ethics. Is it a just and fair use of limited medical resources? There is no easy consensus. One perspective is that the life of an unborn child is a life like any other, and that the resources required to save it are justified, just as they would be for a complex neonatal surgery or a long-term pediatric cancer treatment. From this viewpoint, cost should not be a determining factor when a life is at stake. The value of a human life, they would argue, cannot and should not be quantified in dollars. The birth of a healthy child is a benefit to society that is immeasurable, and the resources expended are a worthy investment in that future. This perspective prioritizes the individual life that can be saved. Another perspective, often termed utilitarian, looks at the bigger picture. It asks whether the immense resources dedicated to one very rare case could be better used to provide a greater good for a greater number of people. For the cost of one case of prolonged somatic support, a public health program could perhaps provide prenatal care for hundreds of at-risk mothers, potentially preventing dozens of premature births and improving the health of an entire community. This is not to devalue the life of the individual fetus, but to weigh that one potential life against the potential to improve the health and well-being of many others. This argument forces us to confront the reality that healthcare resources are not infinite, and that every choice to provide one type of care is also a choice not to provide another. It's important to state that these financial and resource allocation considerations, while present in the background, are almost never the explicit reason for a decision in an individual case. Doctors and families make their choices based on medical feasibility, ethical principles, and personal values. The decision is not made by an accountant with a spreadsheet. However, the systemic pressures are real. The high cost can create an unspoken tension. Could the fear of a massive, uncovered medical bill influence a family's decision, consciously or unconsciously? Does the need to free up an ICU bed ever factor into a hospital's recommendation? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are an unavoidable part of the ecosystem in which these decisions are made. The cost of a miracle is not just emotional and ethical, it is tangible and immense, a quiet but powerful force that shapes the landscape of what is possible at the intersection of life, death, and medicine. In the quiet, climate-controlled hum of the ICU, amidst the rhythmic symphony of ventilators and monitors, a unique and heavy burden rests on the shoulders of the caregivers. The doctors, and especially the nurses at the bedside, are the hands-on custodians of this extraordinary process. They are more than just medical technicians. They are the stewards of a profound paradox, tending to a body that is simultaneously a shrine of memory and a cradle of hope. This dual role exacts a significant emotional and ethical toll, a specific kind of stress known as moral injury, which can leave a lasting impact on the very people we entrust with this most delicate form of care. A critical care nurse's training and professional identity are built around the goal of healing. They work tirelessly to help patients recover, to alleviate suffering, and to restore health. They form therapeutic relationships with their patients and families, communicating, comforting, and advocating for them. But in the case of a brain-dead patient undergoing somatic support, this entire paradigm is turned on its head. The patient they are caring for will never recover. The person, the consciousness they are trained to connect with, is gone. Their mission is not to heal the woman, but to meticulously manage her body as a biological system for the benefit of another unborn patient. This fundamental shift can create a powerful sense of cognitive and emotional dissonance. Imagine the daily routine of a nurse assigned to this case. They come on shift and perform a head-to-toe assessment, just as they would for any other patient. They check the IV lines, monitor the vital signs, administer medications, and document everything with precision. They turn the patient's body every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. They provide mouth care. They clean her. They speak to her respectfully. They are performing all the intimate acts of nursing, acts that are predicated on caring for a living person. Yet, their patient is legally and clinically dead. This constant engagement with a warm, breathing body that is also a corpse can be profoundly unsettling. It blurs the lines that normally provide psychological safety and professional clarity. Many nurses describe a feeling of deep sadness and sometimes even an eerie sense of unreality. The challenge is navigating the line between treating a patient and managing a biological system. Nurses are trained to look for signs of pain or distress in their patients. They might find themselves instinctively reacting to a reflexive muscle movement or a change in heart rate as if it were a sign from the patient, only to have to remind themselves that these are just autonomic signals from a spinal cord that is no longer connected to a brain. They are caring for a body, but their instincts and empathy are wired to care for a person. This disconnect is a source of immense internal conflict. They are, in a very real sense, providing palliative care and prenatal care at the exact same time to the same body. This can lead to what is known as moral injury. Moral injury is different from burnout or compassion fatigue. It is the psychological distress that results from actions or the witnessing of actions that violate one's deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. For a nurse, their core moral belief is to do no harm and to preserve the dignity of their patient. Some nurses involved in these cases can begin to question their role. Are they honoring the deceased woman's dignity, or are they participating in the objectification of her body, reducing it to an incubator? Even if they intellectually support the goal of saving the baby, the day-to-day physical reality of the process can feel like a violation of the natural order of things, a transgression against the sanctity of death. They may feel complicit in a process that, despite its life-giving aim, feels profoundly unnatural. The emotional burden is also shaped by their relationship with the grieving family. The nurse often becomes the family's primary point of contact, their emotional anchor in the sterile ICU environment. They witness the family's raw grief, their agonizing hope, their internal conflicts. They answer the same painful questions day after day. They celebrate the small victories, another week of gestation, and they provide comfort during the terrifying setbacks. They absorb the family's trauma and hope, carrying it with them long after their shift has ended. This deep emotional investment, combined with the ethical complexity of the clinical situation, can be emotionally exhausting in a way that is unique to these cases. They are not just managing a patient, they are holding the emotional center of a family in limbo. To cope, hospitals and nursing teams have developed support systems. Debriefing sessions with chaplains or mental health professionals are crucial. These sessions provide a safe space for nurses and doctors to voice their feelings of confusion, sadness, or moral conflict without judgment. They can share the burden with colleagues who understand the unique pressures of the situation. Some nurses find solace by focusing intensely on the unborn child as their primary patient, creating a psychological separation that allows them to frame their actions in a more positive light. Others focus on the care of the body as an ultimate act of respect and service to the deceased mother, helping her to complete her final wish. They may learn the mother's name, see her picture, and make a conscious effort to think of her as a person, not just a biological vessel. Finding this personal framework is essential for their own psychological survival. The moral burden on the caregiver is a hidden cost of this medical miracle, a silent and profound stress borne by the dedicated professionals who walk the line between life and death every day. The practice of maternal somatic support, while rare everywhere, is not viewed through the same lens across the globe. The decision to embark on this technologically intensive journey is profoundly shaped by the cultural soil in which it is planted. A society's dominant views on death, its legal definition of life, the structure of its healthcare system, and its core family values all combine to create a unique cultural filter. What is celebrated as a medical miracle in one country might be viewed as an unnatural and ethically troubling intervention in another. Exploring these global perspectives reveals just how deeply our relationship with technology is intertwined with our most fundamental cultural beliefs. In North America and much of Western Europe, the medical and legal framework is largely built upon the concept of individual autonomy and the widespread acceptance of brain death as a legal standard. In these regions, the debate, as we've seen, often centers on the conflict between the deceased mother's previously expressed wishes and the potential life of the fetus. The cultural narrative tends to be one of scientific progress, a story of medicine triumphing over tragedy. Media reports often frame these cases in heroic terms, celebrating the miracle babies and the skilled medical teams who make their births possible. While ethical debates certainly occur in hospital committees and academic journals, the broader public sentiment is often one of awe at the technological possibility. The underlying cultural assumption is often that if we can save a life, we should try. Let's contrast this with the perspective in Japan, a country where the concept of brain death has had a much more contested and difficult history. For decades after the first heart transplant in 1968 led to a murder investigation, the Japanese medical community and the public were deeply hesitant to embrace a neurological definition of death. Traditional Shinto and Buddhist beliefs often emphasize the integrity of the body and view death as a gradual transition, not a singular moment defined by a clinical test. The line between life and death is seen as more ambiguous. The family is often considered the primary decision maker, and the idea of declaring a loved one with a beating heart dead is, for many, culturally and emotionally unacceptable. Although a 1997 law finally recognized brain death for the purposes of organ donation, it can only be applied with the prior written consent of the individual and the unanimous agreement of the family. As a result, the number of organ donations from brain-dead donors in Japan remains extremely low compared to Western nations. This cultural context has profound implications for a practice like maternal somatic support. The very first step, declaring the mother brain dead, is already fraught with a level of cultural friction not typically seen in the West. A Japanese family might be far more inclined to view their loved one on a ventilator as a living person in a deep coma, not a corpse. The medical intervention would be seen as sustaining her life, not just her body's functions. While the desire to save the child would be equally strong, the entire ethical and emotional framing of the situation would be different. The practice is not unheard of in Japan, but it is approached with a degree of caution and cultural sensitivity that reflects this different understanding of life's end. The conversation would be less about the rights of the deceased and more about the family's collective responsibility to both the mother and the child. We can also look at societies with a strong, centrally influential state religion. In some predominantly Catholic countries, like Poland or Ireland, the legal and ethical framework is heavily influenced by the Church's profound reverence for unborn life. The legal concept of fetal personhood may be much stronger, and there might be a powerful legal and social presumption in favor of attempting somatic support, regardless of the mother's previously expressed wishes. The state's interest in protecting the fetus could be seen as paramount, creating a situation where the procedure is viewed not just as a medical option, but as a moral and societal imperative. Conversely, in more secular European nations, such as the Netherlands or Belgium, where individual autonomy and the right to euthanasia are strongly enshrined in law, the mother's advance directive would likely be given greater weight, and the decision would be framed more as a private choice for the family, free from state or religious compulsion. The structure of the healthcare system also plays a crucial role. In a system funded by private insurance like that in the United States, the immense cost can become a significant barrier or a source of extreme stress for the family. In countries with robust, publicly funded national health services, the financial burden is lifted from the family, but the question of resource allocation becomes a matter of public policy. A decision might be made in a British or Canadian hospital to limit the duration of support based on a calculation of fetal viability and the responsible stewardship of public resources, a consideration that might be less explicit in a private system. A global perspective teaches us that there is no single, correct way to approach this profound dilemma. Our response to the challenge of maternal somatic support is a mirror reflecting our deepest cultural assumptions. It shows us whether we prioritize individual autonomy or community obligation, how we define the boundary between life and death, and how much faith we place in technology to solve the most fundamental problems of human existence. It is a powerful reminder that while the biology of pregnancy and the technology of the ICU may be universal, the meaning we assign to them is as diverse as humanity itself. We began our journey in ancient Rome with a simple law born of ritual. The Lex Regia demanded that a child be cut from its deceased mother, not with the hope of life, but for the necessity of a separate identity in death. It was an act of spiritual closure. From that quiet, solemn starting point, we have traveled through 2 millennia of faith, science, and human striving. We have watched the motivation shift from saving a soul for the next world to saving a body for this one. We have seen the instrument change from a simple blade, guided by a priest's prayer, to the entire orchestrated complexity of a modern intensive care unit, a technological cathedral where life is held in a fragile, suspended state. This long arc from a simple rite to a complex, technology-driven procedure is more than just a medical history. It is a profound story about who we are and what we value. We have traced the thread from the theological anxieties about original sin and limbo, which drove the practice for centuries, to the first flickering hopes of the Enlightenment, when doctors began to dream of snatching a living child from the jaws of death. We have seen how the invention of the ventilator and the redefinition of death itself tore open a new frontier, transforming a frantic race against minutes into a prolonged, managed marathon of months. Each step in this journey was a response to the central question we posed at the beginning. When one life ends while another has yet to begin, what are our obligations to both? We have seen that with every new technological power, our answer to that question becomes more complex, more nuanced, and more challenging. Technology did not give us a simple solution. It gave us a more profound set of questions. These extraordinary cases, rare as they are, force us to the very edge of our definitions. They compel us to ask what it means to be a person. Is it a beating heart, a functioning brain, a soul, a legal status? They force us to confront the meaning of motherhood. Is it an act of biology, of love, of sacrifice? And can that act continue even after the mother, as a person, is gone? They push us to the limits of what it means to be alive and what it means to be dead, revealing that the boundary we once thought was a clear, bright line is in fact a wide, shadowed, and mysterious shore. We have created a space between worlds, a technological limbo, and we must now navigate the moral and emotional landscape of that new territory. There are no easy answers here. There is no simple formula that can balance the posthumous autonomy of a deceased woman against the potential life of her unborn child. There is no algorithm that can weigh the immense grief of a family against their desperate hope. There is no universal ethic that can reconcile the different cultural and religious truths that people hold dear. To pretend that a single correct answer exists would be to diminish the profound gravity of the situation. Perhaps the point is not to find a definitive answer, but to learn how to ask the questions with humility, with compassion, and with a deep respect for the mystery that lies at the heart of it all. What these stories ultimately offer is a testament to the enduring power of human connection. They show us the lengths to which a family will go for the love of a child they have not yet met. They reveal the profound dedication of caregivers who pour their skill and their hearts into a task that defies easy categorization. And most of all, they stand as a silent, powerful monument to the women at their center. These women, in their final act, become a bridge between death and life. Their bodies a vessel of a love so powerful it persists beyond the end of their own story, writing the first chapter of another. This is a narrative not of technological hubris, but of human loss, enduring love, and our relentless, often paradoxical, drive to nurture and preserve life, even in the very shadow of death. It is a quiet reminder that our greatest scientific achievements do not remove us from the ancient questions of existence. They only bring us back to them with a deeper sense of wonder and of awe.